And here's where we're headed in this chapter. We're going to take our geometry node setup and apply our lighting and our camera. And we're going to do a rapid fire review, so be sure to follow along after the video with the cheat sheets. I'm going to go through these pretty quick. This is all review from beginner level courses. And our very first step is to set up our lighting and our camera. So starting in the animation tab, turn on rendering and turn on the drips and dust to make sure we have everything enabled. And this is sort of where we're starting off with. Then jump into our warp properties, set up volume scatter, lower the density so that we can get that atmospheric effect going into our scene. Going into our image properties, setting up that 1280 by 540, 21 by 9 aspect ratio. End frame is going to be 72 frames, so we're doing a 3-second render animation. Next, I'm setting up the camera here. So the big tip here is that we want this to be symmetrical. So I have it perfectly aligned with the grid right here. So that's symmetrical both at the top and the sides. So it's going to be a formal balance like we talked about in the art of lighting. Next, I'm jumping to frame 1 and making sure the animation looks good here. And you notice that my particles ended up being a little bit too high, so I had to move them down just as a starting point. And then I'm moving my light in place. Again, we're doing a very symmetrical scene here. So this light is going to be right in the center, creating that formal balance. And the note here is that the light, I'm putting it right on top of the camera so that we get that really exaggerated fall off, which ended up looking really nice in the final render. From here, I'm lowering the intensity. It was a little bit too bright, a little bit too blown out, so I'm bringing that down to 500. Jump into my camera settings, turning on depth of field, lowering the f-stop so that we get that really exaggerated depth of field. And then currently everything's out of focus, so we're going to need to drop in an empty and then go back to our depth of field here and then put the focus object back on the empty, which is at the center of the world. Now at this point, everything just kind of felt too much, so we're going to do the final tweaks here. And step number 2 is to set up our final geometry node tweaks. So I'm going to add my geometry nodes panel to my animation tab so we can work on it here. And then I'm selecting the drips, and then I went ahead and boosted up the density a lot on that. We went from 50 to 100 just so we can see it a lot more. There wasn't very many showing up after I put in the depth of field. And then I'm lowering the isosphere down all the way down to 0.001, so these particles end up being a lot smaller so they're not so dominant in the scene. From here, I did a test animation. Everything was going too fast still. So I went ahead and put another math node after the scene here, and I went down to 0.1. And I went down to 0.1, so we're essentially slowing it down to 10% of the animation that it was. Jumping over to my dust particles, I felt that I needed more, so I went up on the density from 50 to 100, and then again lowered the radius to 0.005, making everything a lot smaller. And then everything started to fall together there. Next, I felt everything was too bright still. I wanted everything to feel more translucent. So from here, I'm going to set up a material to do that. We got the standard material that we have that came on the object, but this material doesn't actually get assigned to the geometry nodes because all of these objects here are actually created in geometry nodes. So this is a pretty weird part of geometry nodes. If you create the object, such as a mesh object, such as an isosphere, inside of the geometry nodes, you cannot just assign the material on the object level. It has to be done on the geometry nodes level. So I'm adding in a set material node. I'm going to assign that material, the default material, and then I'm just going to lower it and darken it down to somewhere around 0.1. And then everything started to feel a lot more translucent. And then I'm going over to the drips and doing the same thing, adding that set material and then assigning that material to that. And that'll be a wrap for this chapter, and we'll continue in the next chapter.